In today's episode of True Crimes Unfold, we turn to the quiet suburbs of Florida, where a charming man turned his mother's house into a chamber of horrors. Please note that the descriptions of events and scenarios in this video may be disturbing for some viewers. Discretion is advised. Details of the videos are taken from actual case files. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're listening from and the next true crime destination we should explore, and we'll make sure to add them to our list. Also, don't forget to subscribe to get new stories as soon as they're released daily. Now settle in, get ready, and let's begin. Let me tell you about a house in Jacksonville. Not the kind that makes headlines right away. Just a modest place with peeling paint and crooked shutters. The kind of home that makes you cross the street without knowing exactly why. The summer of 2015 was particularly brutal there. The kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and reality bend. That's when they found her, or rather parts of her, buried in the backyard of 1915 Cassat Avenue. Johnny Gunter, age 30, had been missing for months, but she wasn't alone down there. Not by far. But to understand the horror of what happened to Johnny and the others, we need to go back. Back to 1987, when a nurse named Terry met a patient who came asking about tattoo removal. He had beautiful hands, she'd later recall. Elegant, well-maintained hands that would eventually wrap around her throat. Russell Tellis wasn't born a monster. At least, that's what the court psychiatrists would claim. In the trailer behind his childhood home, young Russell and his brother learned early lessons about pain from their father. Lessons that would echo through decades and claim dozens of victims. The neighbors noticed things, of course. The late-night screams they convinced themselves were cats fighting. The women who entered the house but weren't seen leaving. The terrible mechanical sounds from the backyard at 3 a.m. They filed complaints, 83 of them, each one a desperate plea that something wasn't right at the Tellis house. But Russell was clever. Each time police came, he'd greet them with those beautiful hands and that disarming smile. Just a misunderstanding, he'd say. And they'd leave, never noticing the fresh dirt in his yard or the faint scratching sounds coming from below. Terry noticed things too, in the beginning. The way Russell's smile never quite reached his eyes. How he'd stare too long at women on the street. The strange gifts he'd bring home. Jewelry that seemed worn. Diaries with torn-out pages. But by then, she wore his ring and carried his child. And in Russell's world, leaving wasn't an option. I was working the case back then, gathering missing persons reports that all seemed to lead nowhere. Until that night in May, when we decided to set a trap. We didn't know then that Russell had already set his own. Literal traps, razor blades and nails scattered across his yard to keep his secrets buried. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about Johnny Gunter's last night alive. About the moment she realized the charming man offering her a ride wasn't taking her home. About the house that devoured souls. And the monster who wore a smile like a mask. You see, the most terrifying thing about Russell Tellis wasn't the violence. It was how normal he seemed. How he could chat with neighbors, shop for groceries, even attend church, all while his basement held unspeakable horrors. The story I'm about to tell you. Well, let's just say there's a reason I still check my locks 3 times before bed. Because monsters don't hide under beds anymore. Sometimes they live next door with beautiful hands and empty eyes, waiting to invite you in. You know what's strange about evil? How it seeps into walls, into foundations. The Tellis house knew darkness long before Russell made it his playground. Those same rooms had witnessed his own childhood torments. A father's drunken rage, a mother's desperate attempt to protect her sons by banishing them to the backyard trailer. Terry discovered this truth slowly, like poison dripping into a clean well. The first signs were small: missing jewelry, unexplained absences. But then came that night in February when she woke to find Russell standing over their bed, studying her sleeping form with those beautiful, terrible hands, clenching and unclenching in the moonlight. "Just watching you breathe," he'd said, smiling that empty smile. The neighbors' dogs were the first to sense something wrong. One by one, they stopped barking at night, not out of peace, but terror. Mrs. Davidson at number 1917 told me how her German Shepherd, a former police dog, would whimper and hide whenever Russell walked past. Animals know things we've forgotten how to know. Then came the modifications to the house. The tall fences went up first, topped with razor wire that gleamed like teeth in the Florida sun. Security cameras appeared, their red eyes blinking in the darkness. But they weren't pointing out at potential intruders. They were aimed inward, at the house itself. Terry learned to sleep through the sounds from the basement, the whirring, the muffled thumps, the occasional scream that Russell insisted was just the old water heater. But it was the laughter that haunted her most. How he would sit in his favorite chair, flipping through photographs only he could see, chuckling softly to himself. The neighbors started noticing things missing. Small things at first: garden tools, extension cords, car batteries. Then Miss Thompson's daughter mentioned seeing Russell late one night, dragging something heavy wrapped in plastic into his garage. When questioned, he said it was just old carpeting. The dark stains, he explained, were from water damage. But it was the Christmas party of '89 that should have warned us all. Russell, uncharacteristically social, invited the entire neighborhood. Only 3 families came, but those who did noticed strange things, like how he'd installed heavy locks on the outside of interior doors, how the basement door was reinforced with steel, how he kept glancing at his watch, as if waiting for something. Terry found the hidden room by accident while cleaning, behind the water heater, a door sealed with multiple locks. When she asked Russell about it, he flew into a rage so terrible she grabbed their daughter and ran. But where do you run when the monster holds all the keys? The police reports started piling up. Women vanishing from nearby truck stops. Prostitutes last seen getting into a car that matched Russell's. But he was careful. So careful. Always with an alibi. Always with those clean, manicured hands ready to help the officers fill out their reports. I remember interviewing Terry after she finally escaped. "The worst part," she whispered, "wasn't the violence. It was watching someone you love turn into something else, something hungry." But we still hadn't found the tunnel system, hadn't discovered why the electric bills for that modest house were higher than a factory's, hadn't understood why Russell spent so much time gardening at night. That would all come later, after Johnny Gunter made the mistake of trusting those beautiful hands. They say evil has a smell. In the summer of 2015, the neighbors finally understood what that meant. The odor began subtly, something like copper and wet earth after rain. But as the Florida heat intensified, so did the stench. Even the flies seemed different around the Tellis house. Bigger, darker, as if fed on something unspeakable. I remember the day we first entered what the media would later call the Devil's Workshop. The neighbors had called about that smell. Complaint number 83. But this time was different. This time, we had a warrant. The front of the house maintained its facade of normalcy. Family photos on walls, dishes in the sink, a TV guide open to that evening's programs. But there were inconsistencies, like how every mirror was covered with black cloth, how the kitchen knives were arranged by size, their blades gleaming with an attention that spoke of obsession rather than cleanliness. The basement door had 13 locks. We counted them, each one more elaborate than the last, but it was the smell that hit us first. A wall of decay, so thick it felt physical. Officer Martinez vomited. I wish I had too. What we found down there would haunt my dreams for years to come. The main room was organized. That's what struck me most. Everything labeled, catalogued, tools arranged with surgical precision, video equipment set up in corners, and the walls. God, the walls. They were covered in Polaroids. Hundreds of them. Each one showing a different woman. Some smiling, some terrified, some. Behind the water heater, we found the first hidden door. Then another. And another. Russell had created a maze beneath his house. Rooms within rooms, each with its own purpose, each with its own horrors. The electricity bills suddenly made sense. He'd been running industrial freezers down there, preserving things, collecting them. But it was room 7 that broke me. A perfectly normal bedroom, like something from a furniture catalog. Floral wallpaper, a neatly made bed, even a teddy bear propped against the pillows. Everything pristine, untouched, waiting. We later learned from his journals that this room was meant for Terry, his endgame, his masterpiece that never came to be. The neighbors began coming forward then. Mrs. Davidson recalled the night she saw Russell dragging heavy garbage bags to his car at 3 a.m. Mr. Thompson remembered the sounds of digging in the backyard during storms, when the thunder would mask other noises. And little Tommy from next door told us about the day he lost his ball over Russell's fence and saw the sleeping ladies in the garden. We found Johnny Gunter's remains exactly where Tommy had seen. Those sleeping ladies, but she wasn't alone. The ground-penetrating radar revealed the truth. Russell's garden wasn't just a garden. It was a graveyard. Each flower bed marked a victim. He'd been planting roses over them, one for each life he took. The roses were blood red and unnaturally large, but the true horror wasn't in the tools, the rooms, or even the graves. It was in Russell's journals, dozens of them, meticulously kept. He wrote about his victims like a wine connoisseur describing vintages. Their fears, their pleas, their final moments, all documented with those beautiful, steady hands. One entry stands out. The night Johnny Gunter arrived. She notices things, he wrote, the way the others didn't. She saw the truth behind my smile. For that, she'll get special treatment. After all, every rose garden needs fertilizer. But we still hadn't found the worst room. The one behind the freezers. The one where Russell kept his works in progress. You see, some of his victims were still alive when we raided the house. Still breathing in those numbered rooms, waiting for their turn in the garden. There's something about dawn in Florida. The way darkness reluctantly peels back, like lifting a scab. That's when we moved in on Russell's house. May 28th, 2015. The morning dew was still fresh on those blood-red roses when our tactical team took position. We'd been watching him for days. Russell had developed routines, predictable patterns. Every morning at 6:17, he'd check his mailbox, then walk the perimeter of his property. Always clockwise, always 13 steps between pauses. But this morning was different. He knew something was wrong. The first officer went down before we even reached the front door. Not shot, trapped. Russell had turned his entire yard into a maze of buried razors and nail boards. Even his garden paths were rigged. Later, we learned he'd mapped it all out in one of his journals. A spider's web, and he was the spider. Inside, the house fought back. Every door was booby-trapped. Every hallway rigged with tripwires. But it was the recordings that got to us most. Speakers hidden in the walls played sounds of women screaming, crying, begging. We couldn't tell which were real and which were recordings. That was the point, we realized later. Pure psychological warfare. The first survivor we found was barely alive, hidden behind a false wall in the kitchen, a space so small it defied belief. She'd been there for 3 months. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, reported missing from a truck stop in Georgia. When we found her, she was scratching at the wall with bloodied fingers. Not trying to get out, she told us later. She was trying to scratch a message for the next girl. He never sleeps. But Russell had vanished. While we cleared the house room by room, he was moving through his tunnel system, a network of narrow passages he dug beneath the neighborhood. Some led to storm drains, others to abandoned buildings. One even connected to the old bomb shelter under the elementary school 3 blocks away. In the basement, each room told a story. Room 1, photography, where he documented their arrival. Room 2, the breaking room, tools laid out like surgical instruments. Room 3, the trophy room, where he kept their belongings arranged by date. Each room more horrific than the last. Then we found Room X, unmarked on his maps. A metal door, sealed with a handprint scanner. Inside, a command center. Monitors showing feeds from cameras hidden all over the neighborhood. Files on potential victims. Surveillance photos, daily routines, all meticulously documented. He'd been hunting for years, cataloging his prey like a naturalist. The survivors' testimonies painted a picture worse than our darkest assumptions. Russell didn't just kill, he collected, studied, experimented. Some victims he kept alive for months, testing their limits, breaking them down piece by piece. He filmed everything, narrating like a professor giving a lecture. We found him finally, in the last place we expected, his mother's grave. He'd dug a bunker beneath her headstone years ago. When we cornered him, those beautiful hands were still clean, nails perfectly manicured. He smiled that empty smile and said only one thing. "Did you water my roses?" But it was what we found on his person that chilled us most. A fresh Polaroid, taken that morning. A woman we hadn't found yet. In the photo, she was still alive, holding that day's newspaper. The hunt wasn't over. You see, Russell hadn't been working alone. Those tunnel systems, those elaborate traps, it was too much for one person. And those clean hands of his, someone else had to do the dirty work. Someone we hadn't got yet. Someone who might be listening to this very story. Every horror story has an ending, but some endings are just new beginnings. The woman in Russell's final Polaroid. We found her. But I sometimes wish we hadn't. What we discovered in that bomb shelter beneath the school changed everything we thought we knew about Russell Tellis. Her name was Angela Winters. Unlike the others, she wasn't a random target. She was a journalist investigating cold cases in Jacksonville. She'd gotten too close to something. Not just Russell's crimes, but something bigger. Something that reached into the darkest corners of the city's history. In Angela's research files, we found connections. Other houses, other gardens, other men with beautiful, clean hands. Russell wasn't an anomaly. He was part of a pattern. Every 20 years since 1935, Jacksonville had seen a spike in missing persons cases. Each time centered around a different house. Each time involving men who smiled empty smiles. The trial was a maze of its own. Russell spoke only once when asked about his motives. "You still don't see it, do you?" he whispered. "The house chose me, just like it chose the others, just like it's choosing someone right now." We found Terry living in Seattle under a new name. When we told her about Russell's capture, she didn't seem relieved. Instead, she asked about the house. Was it still standing? Had we burned it down? When we said no, she started crying. "Then it's not over," she said. "It's never over." The evidence room holding Russell's belongings burned down 3 days after his conviction. The fire marshal called it electrical, but I saw the security footage. Someone with beautiful, clean hands had visited just hours before. Someone who moved like Russell, smiled like Russell. They demolished the house in 2017. The ground where it stood remains empty. Nothing will grow there, not even weeds. But sometimes, late at night, neighbors report seeing lights moving beneath the soil. And those roses, they keep coming back, blood red and impossibly large. No matter how many times they're pulled up. Russell died in prison last year. Heart attack, they said. But his last visitor reported his final words. "The house is calling. Another set of hands has answered." 2 days ago, a real estate listing appeared online. A modest home for sale in Jacksonville. The photos show peeling paint, crooked shutters, and in one window, just barely visible, a reflection of hands. Beautiful, clean hands beckoning. They say evil has a smell. But what they don't tell you is that evil also has a home. And sometimes it's looking for new tenants. Sleep well tonight, friends. And if you're house hunting in Jacksonville, maybe skip the fixer-uppers